Hey guys. So, about around this time last year, I did a video on my top decks for shadow work. And over the year of really using tarot for shadow work, I've learned a lot. And so, essentially, my thoughts on this had changed. And so, I kind of wanted to make another video on it. Um, I have since actually taken down the previous video just because my opinions have changed so much. In the previous video, I really kind of more looked at it through the lens of self healing and using tarot for self healing, which shadow work is essentially self healing, but it is also really diving into the darker parts of ourselves and the parts of ourselves that are not the greatest and having to confront that, to face that. And I didn't feel I really conveyed that very well in this previous video. So I really wanted to talk about this today and talk about the decks that I have really been gravitating towards for shadow work and how they have been helping me quite a bit and why each one specifically I've chosen to share with you. Now, first and foremost, I will say that some of these decks are mass market available and some of them are indie. One is out of print, but there is a mass market version of it available. So, just so you guys know, if you're looking for any of these specific decks, most of them should be available to you. And then the other thing I kind of wanted to get into really quick before I started talking about these decks specifically is why we would use tarot for shadow work. Well, to me personally, and this is how I would use or how I use tarot for shadow work and why, is my tarot journey essentially started with me going through a very difficult time in my life and turning to learning tarot because I wanted something to give me direction and I sort of wanted a compass in a way. And tarot has always provided me that. I've always laid down cards and journaled about it when I've been struggling with something, when I've had something on my mind. Excuse me. And tarot has always given me a different perspective or shed light on something that I'm not seeing. And that has tied directly into shadow work because oftentimes I have to do shadow work on something that I don't want to see. So that is why I use tarot for shadow work. Tarot to me is deeply psychological, and shadow work is very psychological as well, of course. So I hope that made sense into my explanation there. But let's get into the decks and kind of why I use these, how I use these, why I chose them, and what about them I feel really pertains to doing shadow work. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Dark Goddess Tarot. This is the indie version, which is out of print, but there is a mass market edition of this deck, which I personally don't like. I like the indie version better, so I'm glad I was able to get this before it was not available. But that's just my personal preference. This deck has a very specific purpose. I use it for draws. I draw a goddess, one card on the dark moon, and then I kind of read in the guidebook for what the message is conveying for that goddess, and then how it can pertain to shadow work or what lesson I might need to learn about myself with shadow work. And I have a specific shadow work journal that I use that for, but this is how I use this deck. And this is a practice that actually was inspired to me by Lisa. Lisa Papez. She was formerly Supportive Tarot, but I think her channel is just Lisa Papez now. But yeah, she essentially inspired that practice, and I still do it, and I love it. It's one way to work with the dark goddess and the divine feminine and kind of tie in shadow work. So that's a very specific way to do it, but that is one way that I do it. Now, you might not think that this deck would be for shadow work, looking at it firsthand. I actually was not sure I wanted to purchase this deck just because I felt that it might be too light, but it's not. And I will explain why. So specifically in the guidebook here, the author and creator Chris Ann has provided in each card description a shadow seer. So essentially this will give you the shadow side of the card, which is actually extremely helpful when you're doing a reading on shadow work and you want to implement that shadow side of the card to help guide you into what you may not be seeing. So that is one that I really would recommend for shadow work, and one that most people might not think about, or at first glance I'd say. So the next one here is the Marielle Tarot. This is, along with the Dark Goddess, this is the only deck that I have that did show up in my previous video. But the reason why I recommend this deck for shadow work is because this is a very deep deck, and it is a very different way of looking at tarot. It's kind of its own system. It's a mix between Thoth and Rider-Waite, in my opinion. And the guidebook is incredible. So for each card, you really get quite a bit of entries into really deep diving into the meanings of these cards and why the artist specifically chose this. And it's all under a very symbolic spiritual lens. But I feel like that approach really gets you thinking on a psychological level, and I feel like approaching it that way will definitely help you explore the shadow parts of yourself and explore your mind. So that's why I recommend the Marielle Tarot for shadow work. This is the only oracle deck that will show up in this video. You can use many oracle decks for shadow work, but this one I specifically chose just because it is so balanced, and it is very psychological. The images are very evocative, and there are specific cards in here that do have a lot to do with either healing or the darker aspects of us. So this one, I also use this deck for dream work, but this card right here specifically is one of the biggest reasons why I chose to include it and use it for shadow work. But yeah, this one, you really can't go wrong. This is the Oracle of Echoes. Probably one of my favorite oracle decks, truthfully. Again, very psychological as well. Now, the next one, sorry, I'm adjusting here and I bumped the camera. The next one having problems. I'm going to recommend, I'm going to say is simply that another point that I forgot to bring up in the beginning of the video, that this sort of jarred my memory on that, is that when it comes to working with tarot and shadow work, you don't have to specifically pick dark decks. I do own a lot of decks that are considered darker. That's just because I do enjoy a lot of that aesthetic, depending on how it's done. But you can honestly have a shadow work deck that has unicorns all over it. Whatever works for you, whatever kind of helps you think, get yourself thinking, get yourself going deeper into your psyche, get yourself looking at the aspects of you that you don't particularly want to. That is essentially what shadow work is, and that can be delivered in any way that you see fit because it is your practice. But the reason why I chose this deck specifically to include in my shadow work, even though I have not had it for very long, is because, again, much like the Oracle of Echoes, I find these images, again, I will use the word evocative, very provoking in the shadowy aspects of us. Definitely not something that you would come across every day, and there's just something about this deck that I feel it could reach deep, especially on an intuitive level, not so much even from referring to the guidebook and essentially what the author has to say, And that, of course, by no means is to knock shade at the author and her beautiful work. I'm really more saying that you can use this in sort of an intuitive way. For shadow work. Put it back in the box, and I'm doing it off camera because, yeah. Alright, so that is the Black Tarot. And then the last deck I'm going to recommend, and this one I have been ranting and raving about since I received it a few months ago. This is the Goliath Tarot deck. And I really enjoy the guidebook. I'm just going to do this because it'll be easier right now. In the beginning, there is a whole introduction on how he kind of started to meet his shadow self and the importance of what that meant on his own spiritual journey. But he has put so much into this deck and so much into this guidebook. It's incredible to read through, and each entry is just so profound and so deeply thought through. Like I really think this deck is definitely much like the Marielle in the sense that it's very deep, but this is more to the connection of nature in the spiritual sense and connection through the natural world and the cycles around us too, and the shadows around us. At least that is kind of how I look at it. But he also has included a handful of extra cards in here, and a lot of them do pertain to shadow work. There's one called the Shadow Self, I believe, and then there's the Shadow Cat, which I really liked. But I have a whole walkthrough of this deck on my channel. It was a live I did when I received it that was like an hour long. So, but this deck is truly incredible for shadow work. I will say on the terms of availability, I know he had recently, just as a few days ago, had said that it was almost sold out for the second edition of this deck, and that it might be a little bit before there's another print run, but he will be doing another print run of this, as far as my knowledge goes and what I've seen him speak about on Instagram. You can always ask him directly, but yeah, that is the Goliath Tarot, and again, this is another one that is a very deep, thought-provoking deck. It is one that when you spend time with this deck, you really want to spend time with it. I mean, it's not, when I do readings with this deck, I really can't just pull it out and do a quick reading. If I'm going to spend time with this deck, I'm going to spend time with this deck. That's basically the best way to describe my experience with it so far, and how, to me, it has definitely had that, it's definitely been very helpful for shadow work, and very helpful in getting me to think and see things in ways that I didn't think I could. So, yeah. So that is my current recommendations for shadow work, for decks for shadow work. I hope you guys, once again, I'm bumping the camera. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, thank you for watching, and blessed be.